Break the pattern today, or the loop will repeat itself tomorrow. I saw this quote recently, and I think it actually describes the comment from the last video fairly well. The top comment was basically talking about cycles in human nature and how people can fall back to the same actions and situations because of the habits and mannerism that we built over time. And I guess there are a few ways of interpreting this, but I think the premise is that people fall back onto what is familiar, and unfortunately, they often find comfort in that familiarity, even if it's not really what's best for them. And I think that it's actually a really interesting part of human nature because familiar doesn't necessarily mean good, it just means we know what to expect. And I think our brains really like that. Our brains really like predictability. And even if something isn't necessarily making us happy in the moment, there's a certain amount of comfort in knowing how it's going to play out. You know exactly what you're getting, you know exactly how you're going to react, and you don't have to step into the unknown. And I think that's where these cycles start. And we do something and we get a certain result and we just get used to that result, and eventually that behavior just becomes normal to us. So then we keep repeating it again and again, and eventually we stop even questioning why we're doing it. And I think that's the scary part because you can really get stuck in this cycle without even realizing that you're in one to begin with. And I think this is where habits come into play because it's really easy for you to say that you want something different. You can go and have this completely different vision of your life and set all these goals and tell yourself you're going to change. But if you keep doing the same exact thing every day, you're probably just going to end up in a similar place. You're not going to go anywhere. There's a quote from James Clear that I think fits very well in this situation, and he says, "You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." And I think that's so true because your goals are basically where you want to go, but your systems are what actually get you there, right? And if your system is built around the same habits that you've always had, then eventually those habits are going to pull you back towards the same place. That's why I think breaking the cycle is harder than you just deciding you want something different. You actually have to change the things that are creating the outcome, creating the same situations and same scenarios. And this can be really uncomfortable because now you're not just changing the result, you're changing the process of how you even got there in the first place. I think that the first step to actually breaking one of these cycles is recognizing that you're in one and being aware that change is needed because you really can't change something that you don't even notice, right? There's another quote from James Clear that I really like, and he says, "Improvement often starts with awareness." And I think that's where it starts, just noticing the things that you keep doing, noticing the situations that you keep finding yourself in, and noticing the choices that you keep making because sometimes you don't realize that you're necessarily repeating a pattern until you take a step back and actually look at it. And I think I've had a lot of moments like that where I'll stop and I'll think, wait, why am I doing this? Why do I keep doing this? Like, what the fuck am I? I think it's important to zoom in when you need to observe and zoom out when you need to reflect. This is kind of a more serious conversation now, but I actually had a conversation with someone recently that made me think about this a lot. I won't get into the details because it's not my story to tell, but she had a really unhealthy relationship with this other individual for a very long time. And even after everything that happened, one of the hardest parts about leaving was the idea of moving on, right? Because this person had such a huge part in her life for so many years, and he was familiar, and he was someone that she was used to talking to, and she had built a life around. And even though she knew that the relationship was hurting her, there was still like an off-putting feeling about it all. Like, what was she supposed to do? How was she supposed to find someone else? And how is she supposed to become comfortable finding someone else and finding someone new? And I think that it's a good example of how familiarity and comfort can get confusing, because something being familiar again, doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you, and something being comfortable doesn't also necessarily mean that it's good for you, mean that it's safe. But sometimes you just become so accustomed to something, and the idea of it leaving and being in the unknown feels scarier than staying in it. And I think that's where the cycle becomes really difficult to break because you're not just walking away from the behavior, you're walking away from something that you've been accustomed to for, in this case, 2 years. And I think that's why I don't want to look at these patterns and just say, well, that's just how I am, because I want to understand why we keep returning to them, right? Because if I can understand the pattern, then maybe something will finally change. And I honestly think that this is something that I've been trying to pay more attention to recently, because I've definitely had my moments, I've definitely had my own cycles, and I'll get really motivated about something, go all in for a minute, and then eventually lose that motivation and then make excuses, right? And then I'll eventually find myself right back at the beginning. And the funny thing is, every time I start again, it feels different. I'll tell myself, okay, like this time I'm gonna stick with it. This time I'll do this time I'll do that. But if I haven't actually changed anything about the way I'm approaching it, what's stopping me from ending up in the same exact place again, right? And I think that's the part that I've been trying to understand. Sometimes starting over isn't really starting over. Sometimes you're just restarting the same cycle. I think that's where it gets interesting too, because instead of just asking, how do I stop this? Maybe we should also ask, why do I keep doing this? Or what am I getting out of it? What am I avoiding? And what is this pattern trying to tell me? I think sometimes we need to look at our triggers as things we need to get rid of, right? I think maybe they're actually trying to give us some sort of information and point us in the right direction and point us towards something that we haven't dealt with yet. And I think that changing the way you look at something can completely change the way you respond to it too. Perspective changes everything. So instead of seeing a recurring pattern as proof that something is like wrong with you, you can maybe look at this information next time and be like, okay, I see a pattern, maybe a pattern that I don't necessarily understand yet, but I need to understand it, because how am I supposed to break the cycle if I don't even understand? And again, I think it all starts with awareness. And once you are aware that there's a cycle and there's a problem per se, that you can change it. I think sometimes the reason we keep repeating these cycles is because changing them means that we're confronting something uncomfortable. We're confronting something we don't know about. And it's a lot easier to say, that's just how I am, or I'll deal with it later, or even ignore it completely. And I've definitely done that, but I think to some degree we need to recognize that something isn't working, but actually doing something about it means admitting that we might have to change, and change is uncomfortable. There's a quote that I heard from Layla Hormozy that fits in really well here. She says, "You can't improve what you refuse to face. Avoidance is expensive." And I think that's really true, because avoiding something doesn't actually make it disappear. Usually it just gives the problem more time to become a bigger problem. And eventually you find yourself right back in the same place, wondering how you got there again. So the question becomes this. Okay, you recognize the problem, you understand where it might be coming from, so how do you actually break it? And honestly, I don't think there's some magical secret answer that works for everybody. I think that you just have to do something differently, which might sound obvious, but I also think that it's the hardest part, because if the old pattern is comfortable, then breaking it and breaking the norm means doing something that feels uncomfortable. You have to make the choice, and even if the familiar choice may feel easier in the moment, I think that's where action becomes really important, because you could spend forever just analyzing and thinking about all this shit. You could journal about it, read books about it. You can understand all the details and exactly why you're doing it, but at some point you actually have to do something about it. Otherwise, you're just becoming really self-aware and amounting to nothing. You're continuing the exact same shit that you've been doing. And I don't want to do that personally. I don't want to just understand my patterns. I want to actually change them. At the end of the day, nothing changes if nothing changes. But I don't think that breaking a cycle necessarily means completely changing your life overnight. Sometimes it's something really small. If you always react a certain way, then try reacting a different way. And if you always try to put something off, then do it immediately. If you always stay in the same environment, go somewhere different. You can't heal in the same environment that hurts you. But if you always tell yourself that you're not ready, maybe do it before you feel ready, because I think that's how you actually start creating a new pattern. One different decision and another and another and another and another, until you eventually have all these different decisions, and these different decisions become different habits, and those habits become your new normal, right? And maybe that's exactly what breaking the cycle looks like. It's not one huge moment where you just completely fucking reinvent yourself. It's a bunch of these smaller habits and smaller moments compiled together where you choose something different until eventually the different is what becomes familiar. Action relieves anxiety, right? And I think that's also why change can feel so difficult at times because you're standing at the edge of something unfamiliar and new, and your brain immediately starts giving you reasons not to do it. Like, what if it doesn't work? What if I regret it? What if I fail? And suddenly, staying where you are feels like the safer option. But sometimes I think the only way to find out what happens is to actually take the step because thinking about change and actually changing are two completely different things. Thinking about doing something and doing something are again two completely different things. You can sit there and analyze every possible outcome forever, but eventually you have to move. And sometimes, yes, action relieves anxiety, not because the uncertainty disappears, but because you're finally doing something about it, you know? And I think that's how you start replacing your old cycles and your old habits and all these old things that you once found familiar and somewhat comfortable, but not by waiting until you're completely comfortable, but by getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So I guess that kind of brings us back to the original question about cycles, right? I don't necessarily think that we're doomed to repeat the same things over and over forever. I think that we're just naturally drawn towards what's familiar, right? And if we're not paying attention, familiar can easily become automatic and we just instantly blindly follow these familiar patterns and familiar feelings. But once you start noticing those patterns and noticing that you actually have a choice and noticing that you can either keep repeating them or you can do something different and actually do something about it. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I'm taking away from all of this. Also, I'm definitely not sitting here and trying to pretend that I have everything figured out because I still do catch myself in these cycles all the time, but at least now I can recognize them and maybe that's where change actually starts, you know, not by having everything figured out, but with being honest with yourself and being honest enough to say, wait, I'm doing this one thing and this thing again, and I'm just like in this cycle and it's not necessarily a good cycle. I think now I should try to do something different, you know? Once again, break the pattern today or the loop will repeat tomorrow, right? I think that's probably the best way and easiest way I can put it for everyone to understand. You don't have to completely reinvent yourself overnight. I think that's extremely unrealistic. You just have to recognize that there's a loop and willing to be making a difference and making a different choice because the goal isn't to never fall back into your old pattern. It's to notice when you do and then choose what happens next consciously. And with all that being said, though, thank you for watching. Thank you for staying towards the end. And don't forget that the top comment decides the next video. Take it easy.